And first of all, it's a great honor to stand here before you and to be with this amazing community that I'm relatively new to. I've been mostly with the medical community, but I'll say a little bit. I think Julia has done a fantastic introduction that really sets me up, but I'm hoping to have a lot of conversations over the next 3 days. I'm going to talk to you about the concept of biohappiness, which actually was my father's idea, but I really do think that the time has come for us to move. Maybe biosadness isn't such a good word, but I think there's a lot of sadness out there. And even things like the World Happiness Report that grade countries on how happy their people are completely ignore nature and ecology and food and nutrition. And so I think it's time for us to think about the post-SDG agenda. And I'm going to say a little bit about myself, but very quickly move on. Everyone here is familiar with the problems and challenges, so I'm not going to spend a lot of time there, but really talk a little bit about the work of the foundation. So as Julia said, my sisters and I grew up with my father, an agricultural scientist, so in an agricultural research campus. I heard the word research a lot, and PhD and masters when I was growing up, and maybe that's where my passion for science came from. But my mother was a preschool educationist, but also a feminist and an activist for women's and gender rights. And so she worked with the very underprivileged communities in India, setting up creches for construction workers so that the children could be looked after while their mothers worked. I went on to do an medical in an army medical college, but I did not stay on in the armed forces. I wanted to get out and do some work in the real world. And so I think, as Julia already said, I worked on tuberculosis. That was my area of specialization, which is a disease of poverty. And so my interest in the social and economic and environmental determinants of health probably also came from the fact that I chose tuberculosis as my area for research. And in the last part of my career, where I was at the WHO during the pandemic, as chief scientist, I saw firsthand, firstly, what science and technology could achieve and how vaccines and diagnostics and things could be developed at record speed if scientists around the world came together, which is exactly what happened. Private sector, public sector, everybody with one mission, but also the not so nice side or the ugly side of vaccine nationalism, of inequities, and of fragmentation. World not being able to agree and still not able to agree on how a future pandemic could be actually managed better than the last one was. So that's rather a sad thing, that even after having gone through so much pain, the world is not, or leaders are not able to agree on what we would do next. Now, I'm sure you're familiar with the World Economic Forum's risk report, and if you just look at the green bars, which are the environmental risks, 2 out of the 10 in the short term, extreme weather events and pollution figure in the top 10 global risks. But as you look at a 10-year horizon, you see the number of greens increasing, and you've got natural resource shortages, critical damage to earth systems, biodiversity loss, in addition also to things like the risks of AI and cybersecurity, misinformation. We saw a lot of that during the pandemic and continue to see a lot of misinformation on social media, particularly for the young people today. I think it's really difficult to figure out what's credible and what's not. And inequality turns out to be the most interconnected risk and inequality of various kinds. So again, this audience does not need repeating, but like Julia said, when we talk about climate change, we often forget to talk about biodiversity loss and pollution as the other two sides of the triangle. Now, when it comes to food and nutrition security, the world was doing relatively well. It's, SDG 2 and so on. But because the world is focused, we used to eat, human beings had about 5,000 plant species that we would consume. But today, 70% of our food is either rice, wheat, or maize. And with very intensive agriculture, extractive agriculture, we could call it, and practices for livestock and poultry farming, this has led to a massive decline in agrobiodiversity, loss of pollinators because of all the chemicals we use, decreased soil nutrient quality, and therefore decreased nutrients in our food. And with climate change, it's predicted or modeled that yields are going to go down. And this is happening already in India because of the early summer. The wheat yields are being impacted in the years when we have a very hot early summer. Despite progress over the last 15 or 20 years, we're definitely not on track for most of the SDG indicators. And even today, though we've got so much technology and certainly the world has enough food for everyone, but the proportion of the population that's unable to afford a healthy diet is still about over 30%, and that's 2.5 billion people or so. If you look at extreme weather events in India, for example, this report from the Center for Science and Environment that's tracking it, 270 of the 273 days in 2025 that were monitored had some part of India with one extreme weather event. And you can see a lot of heavy rain and flooding, but also heat waves and some cold waves, storms, landslides, and so on. So this is now part of life, but of course the most vulnerable are the always worst impacted by any of these extreme weather events. I do want to mention air pollution because 9 out of 10 people in the world today breathe air that does not meet the WHO air quality standards of PM 2.5, which is particulate matter less than 2.5 microns, being less than 5 micrograms per cubic meter. And it's responsible for 8 million deaths globally. So it's the second biggest risk factor for health. It's more than tobacco. And you can see among the global risk factors which lead to mortality and morbidity that air pollution and diet are two of the very important risk factors for health. Of course, low and middle income countries in Asia and Africa face the highest burden of air pollution. And I come from a country where the air quality is really bad, particularly in north, in the Indo-Gangetic plain. So I co-chair a commission called Our Common Air along with Helen Clark, former Prime Minister of New Zealand. And we have described air as a shared asset and something that requires multi-sectoral action, again, crossing borders. Air does not, like viruses, you can't contain within national boundaries or state boundaries. And so you do need to work together to deal with something like air pollution. We all blame each other in the winter months, neighboring countries, or we blame farmers for stubble burning, or we always blame something or the other, but really it's a very structural problem, and a lot of it is to do with the way our cities are designed, our public transport systems are designed, and the lack of implementation of environmental guidelines. So enough about the problems. I want to describe a little bit of the work of the foundation, which is now about 37 years old. My father set it up with the first World Food Prize money and all the other prize money that he had ever received. We work across India. And one of the early focus of the foundation was actually on coastal systems, because it was a neglected one. We had lost a lot of the mangroves, because mangroves were considered during the colonial period as just being wasted land and swamps, and the mangrove forests were cleared for housing or for agriculture. And it was in the 80s that, with Japanese support, actually, the foundation started working on the importance of mangrove biodiversity, how to restore and protect the existing forests. And when we had the tsunami in 2004, the villages that were protected by good mangrove forests had much fewer deaths than the villages which were completely unprotected. And that then made people realize, and today we have a large national program where the government actually, it's called the Mishti program. But at the same time, our scientists in the lab were also identifying genes from the mangrove plant that confer saline tolerance. And those genes, obviously today with the kind of genomics that we can do, it's very easy to use gene editing or other tools to move genes from one species into another. But the fact that mangroves had shrunk in Tamil Nadu, the state that I come from 10,000 hectares down to 4,500, it's now back up, has rebounded in 2024 to almost 9,000 hectares, is thanks to the communities actually that have traditionally protected mangroves. It's never the indigenous and local communities that destroy nature. It's always people who come in from the outside or with, outdated ideas or, just because they want to use that land for something else. Amazing biodiversity, and in fact, indigenous people who live there understand the medicinal properties of many of the mangrove species and have traditionally used the bark and other parts of the plant. And there we have champions like Mr. Veerappan now, he goes around, talks about mangroves. We have women who are also using crab or sea bass fattening. So conservation without attention to livelihoods that never works. And it's not a viable proposition in places where people are poor. You can't tell them to stay out of the forest because it's important to conserve the species and we don't care about what's happening to you. So when you can build in livelihood opportunities for them, then it's much easier. And so now we have another program with Microsoft where we're going to use geo AI and sophisticated tools, hyperspectral imaging and so on, to actually try and quantitate the blue carbon along the coast of Tamil Nadu, whether it's mangroves or salt marshes or seagrasses. And this has not been done systematically using these techniques. Of course, we'll have to do a lot of ground truthing and so on, but I think it's really important that we also measure what we can in terms of carbon. Now again, the community there is very poor. They belong to one of the most marginalized communities, what we call scheduled tribes. And so we realized that we can't do piecemeal and we had to do more holistic intervention. So health, education, livelihood, together we set up these computer labs where children can come and study after school, but also the adults can come and use computers. This was introduced way back, 30 years ago, before there was internet. We used satellite technology to bring information to villages because democratization of knowledge is one of the ways to empower people who have been denied the opportunity. And today you can do it very easily. But also you can see those women who are traditional prawn fishers who actually go in and look for prawn with their bare hands. And they told us how much blood they lose because of all the scratches and injuries. And so just providing them gum boots and goggles has made a huge difference to them, and we're also doing health screening and so on. So that's our marine work, which we're now expanding to wetlands, and we can talk more about that later. But the other area we work in is in the Western Ghats, which is one of the biodiversity hotspots in the world because it's very heavily populated and very rich in natural wild biodiversity as well as agrobiodiversity. So we have a center there which is called the Community Agrobiodiversity Center that has worked with communities. Sacred groves is one way of actually conserving local biodiversity because people worship certain plants and they will never destroy those if they're around a church or a temple. So we've restored a lot of sacred groves. But we've also worked with farmers and local tribals. And the plan now is to really, that's the 40 acres of land which was originally belonged to our family, that was a coffee plantation. But the idea now is to have a MS Swaminathan biopark there that will do the science, which will conserve. We already have a lot of RET species that have been conserved and serve as a living classroom to protect and conserve genetic resources while fostering sustainable livelihoods and environmental stewardship. Again, these are Paniya women, again belonging to a very marginalized tribal community, but they are the ones who've conserved these tubers that you see, which we have all forgotten because we're just eating rice and wheat. But these traditional tubers, the greater yam, the lesser yam, taro, tapioca, and elephant foot yam, which is really amazing thing to see, they are the ones who are still using it in their food. These are climate resilient. They have quite good nutrition, would be a very good replacement for cereals. And it's because of their culture. So again, culture is so closely linked with culinary practices and with biodiversity and conservation. But as we so-called develop, we're moving everyone into, into the sort of a set mode of food and all of that. So it's really important to document some of these traditional practices. Now, Wayanad had a terrible landslide. They do have repeated landslides, but the one that happened 2 years ago killed about 1,000 people and displaced hundreds of thousands of people. That was the state of some of the houses when I visited, and you can see the far column there, how that landslide, just overnight, it happened and people were buried in their sleep. They never had a chance to run away. It happened after torrential rain. Never seen that kind of rain before. These youth you see in the middle belong to the community that was impacted by the landslide, and we're now training them to be, we call them conservation stewards. They get a diploma, but they also then go for an apprenticeship. And I think there's tremendous, these kids, when I first visited them in the village, didn't have much hope as to what they were going to do after they finished school, because they're not really into academics. They could not compete with kids who grow up in cities. They would never get into good educational institutions. Many of them go to construction and other kinds of physical labor, or they elope and get married and start having, babies when they're still teenagers. And so I really thought that we need to give them, pride in their own landscapes, in their own rich cultural traditions, and where they could also then become eco-entrepreneurs and so on. So this is an experiment. The first batch of 11 graduated last year, and we have the next batch of 20. But we also do these seed festivals year after year, the last 15 years, where the community actually comes together, and you have academics, you have researchers, but you also have school children coming in there to understand the nature of kind of agrobiodiversity that's available. And again, on the other side of India, in Odisha, a remote tribal area again called Koraput, we've worked with women farmers there who've been not conserving, but growing and eating millets. But again, because of the food systems and the way they are changing, this was going down, the area under millet. Millets are one of the most climate resilient crops, the most nutritious crops that you can think of. And one of the things my father used to say is that because we call them coarse cereals, people started ignoring them, thinking that rice and wheat were better, finer cereals. And then he started calling them nutri-cereals. And 2 years ago, of course, we had the UN announce the year of the millets. I think it was 2022. And some states like Odisha have really now advanced to the point where they're saying not just millets, but other forgotten foods will be supported by government. Not just giving support in the way of seeds, like you can see these women here outside a village seed and grain bank. So community seed banks are really important. We're working on a project called Diversifarm with the government of Norway to try and map community seed banks all over India, because seed sovereignty is important, particularly for small farmers. Many of them are women. But it's not enough to just grow these. You've got to also bring them into school meals, into the public distribution systems, so that there's procurement, the farmers have an incentive, otherwise there's no incentive to grow these crops, and invest in processing and value chains. And this is the International Year of the Woman Farmer as well. And so we mustn't forget that agriculture is now being feminized. Women constitute more than half of the agricultural workforce, and yet all the equipment, all the schemes and everything is made for men. We've just done an analysis where only 15% of the land ownership is actually in the name of women, even though women are the ones actually doing all the work, because men are migrating to cities. And so one of the things we want to do this year of the woman farmer is to get states, or if possible even the government of India, to enact a law that would entitle women, farmers, to be actually called farmers so they can get access to credit, to loans, to water, to all the things that men have access to because their name is on the property, land. Organizing farmers and women especially is a real way of empowering them. We have a lot of self-help groups in India, and when you bring them together and form a federation, let's say of 1,000 women, they're even more powerful now because then they're pooling resources, they get access to credit and loans, and with the right technology, they can go a long way. So they need digital and financial literacy as well. It's not just enough to teach them how to do agricultural things better. I won't spend a lot of time, but I mentioned the biotechnology work. We have a very small group, but again, it's because our motto is science for society. We don't do academic kind of research, but this was some of the work the scientists did looking at the genes in mangrove plants, transplanting them into rice, and then showing that the rice, which had the superoxide dismutase gene, enhanced drought and salinity tolerance, but we couldn't proceed with the field trials because this was a genetic recombinant, and India has regulations that don't allow this to happen. But today with gene editing, you could probably do this much more efficiently. We also have work on soil microbiome, and this is some work one of our colleagues did looking at the roots of paddy, different kinds of varieties of paddy, and identifying microorganisms that enhance soil fertility but also increase crop growth and yield and could be a promising alternative to conventional chemical inputs. So a lot of work on bio inputs that's happening. Technology. So this app, again, it's about 12, 13 years old now. It's not new. It's called the Fisher-Friendly Mobile Application. And it has a number of features, but what's unique about this is it was developed in a participatory way with the fishing community. It wasn't that an app was developed and taken to them. And every year the feedback comes in from the fishermen who say, we'd like this or that feature to be added. And so it's had 54 iterations. It has a lot of information that some of it is offline. They can use it even when they're out at sea. Some of it has to be online. It's available in all our 9 Indian coastal languages. INCOIS, which is the Indian National Coastal and Ocean Information Services, and Qualcomm were the partners. And delighted that this app actually won the inaugural Tech for Nature Award at the IUCN Tech for Nature Award at a conference in Dubai a few months ago. That's Dr. Velveri, who leads our marine and coastal fisheries program. And it won it for the feature that helped protect olive ridley nesting sites. So even though it has a lot of features, that it won this particular award because it warns fishermen when their boats come near a nesting site, the beach, so that they can stay away. For the women, who often again left behind, but who have all the drudgery of post-harvest fisheries, they are the ones who take the fish to the market, clean it, dry it, sell it. We now have a large program actually investing in both digital and financial literacy, but also in things like solar dryers and helping them to set up enterprises that can help them earn much better and reduce their drudgery. So this was with the Reliance Foundation, and we are hoping that this work can actually expand. To move to health, which is where I'm focusing, climate change, I think, unless we see it as an issue that's actually impacting our health today, we're not going to be we're not going to take it as urgently as it should be. It has a lot of impacts, right from vector-borne diseases to the direct impacts of heat-related illnesses. Of course, from extreme weather events, if you have a flood or a cyclone, you're going to be caught up in that. Malnutrition, non-communicable diseases. It also depends on who you are, where you are, what your exposure is, and what your capacity is to either withstand or adapt to these changes. We're doing a lot of work on heat, and again, I'm not going to go into the details. This is something that's impacting millions of people globally. With global warming and increase in humidity, we are reaching the point in some parts of the world where people will no longer be able to live and survive, and so we're going to see climate migrants happening. Number of things that heat does. It's not just the heat stroke. It impacts immune system. It causes chronic inflammation, mental health. That's the global surface temperatures increase, and the increase in the deaths, the excess deaths every year, just been going up and up in all parts of the world, including in Europe. Right here, you have a lot of heat-related deaths, especially amongst the elderly. So we produced this report in 2024 that looked at all the data around climate and health in India. And we found that, yes, there was a disproportionate impact on women and children. There was a clear link between natural disasters and gender-based violence, which is very, very sad, because already 1 in 3 women worldwide are exposed to violence, usually from an intimate partner. And if that's going to get worse because of climate change, then we're really in trouble. We do need more research and more comprehensive data coming from different sources to get integrated. So, for example, climate and health data, there's not a lot of information that overlays these two. So we need agriculture, climate, natural resources, and health data to come together. So we have a lot of information there. The report is on our website. We did another survey last year where we went around the country asking women what happened to them during the worst of the summer months. And a large majority reported physical health issues, mental health issues, they can't sleep at night, increase in domestic violence, a lot of reproductive tract. So basically we said, any climate-related adaptation plan needs to be gender sensitive and gender responsive. And many of them are not currently. We also need to look at things like parametric insurance. There have been a few small experiments in India which have had payouts for people during the hottest days when they don't have to go out to protect their health by not going out. If you're a daily wage laborer or a person who has to go out and sell vegetables so you can feed your family, you will go out regardless of how hot it is. If you can get a payout, maybe you can be protected. Okay, and so we're just launching this new study now that's going to use artificial intelligence to see if we can develop a better early warning tool for people based also on their own biology, and simultaneously work on health system preparedness and community adaptive strategy. So this is something that's just starting. So before I close, or rather the main, I wanted to come to biohappiness. And so this is what my father said. And in fact, this book was launched, I believe, at the Alliance headquarters in Rome, and then there was another one in the IUCN, where, Julia, I think you facilitated a book launch and discussion. So it's really about putting ecology at the center, and that then leads to better nutritional and health outcomes as well as sustainable livelihoods. So ecology at the core, natural capital as a foundation, leading to nutrition, sovereignty, and it aligns very nicely with One Health, planetary health, and so on, livelihoods, resilience as well. And then how do we measure this? So here's a proposal for us. And I was looking at what are the other indicators we use today. We use GDP, of course. Just economics alone doesn't look at anything else, completely ignores nature and biodiversity. We have the World Happiness Report that I talked about, which also doesn't really give a lot of importance to nature. And then we have the SDGs. But could we think of something different post-2030? And this is just a proposal that we could build on and discuss. How would we have a biohappiness index? What would be the indicators? How would we weight them? And so on. And this would tell people much more clearly that, yes, maybe the incomes are increasing, but nature's dying all around you, and so this is not a sustainable way of development. So some states in India are now starting biohappiness centers in the universities, and that's the latest edition of the book that we reprinted last year during my father's centenary. And so I want to end with what happens when we shift from a measurement type approach, like an SDG approach, to a systems transformation, and that's what Julia talked about, looking at everything as being interconnected, not just focusing on one at the expense of the other, but looking at pillars like enabling ecosystems, women and youth, putting women and youth first, of course regenerative farming or agroecology, looking at innovation and what science and technology can bring, not neglecting the forgotten crops, so biodiversity for nutrition, eco-technology, which is combining traditional knowledge with modern tools of science and technology, because sometimes we end up doing one or the other. And finally, healthier choices for people are also healthier choices for the planet. Thank you very much for this.